I'm Michael Elliott. And our next guest is Scott Ray, VP of Government and Education Relations and Senior PKI Architect of DigiCert. Scott is a leading figure in securing healthcare information, particularly the exchange of healthcare electronic records as prescribed by the federal government's DIRECT project. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Michael. I'm really happy to be here.
Now, this is a topic that's really on everyone's mind. You know, we've seen daily reports of the hacks that are going on at Target and Sony. Particularly, they're worried about their healthcare records. And I'd like you to kind of talk about and discuss a little bit around security around healthcare and what we need to really start thinking about.
So rightly so, we should be concerned about our healthcare record. It is probably the most valuable data that we possess about ourselves. It's the crown jewels, so to speak, and we essentially want to protect that with the utmost controls. The good news is we do actually have technology that's available to do this, and perhaps we can talk a little bit about that today.
Absolutely. So describe the situation and need for consumers to demand greater privacy and security.
So even though we have the technology available today, we actually, as consumers, need to ensure and demand that that technology be implemented. The corporations that utilize devices that collect data and store data about us, especially healthcare data, their primary focus is actually their stakeholders, who are the people that they're working for, not necessarily us as data holders. So we need to demand as consumers that the controls be in place. The good news is we do have controls that allow us to protect our data. We just need to demand it.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about some of those threats.
So one of the things that we have to protect against, we know that in healthcare, for instance, not only is it probably the most important data that we collect, but as an industry, healthcare has been perhaps a little slower to come to the table to utilize things like the internet to be able to move data around. And probably justly so, being concerned about the security that's available when you move to that type of platform. But other industries have been there. Financial industry, right, etc., is a good example, has been there for a long time. And so the advantage to the healthcare industry is that they can leverage the lessons learned by the financial industry. However, if I could probably quote a couple of numbers. Healthcare, in 2009, the government mandated reporting of any breach of health data records for any record set greater than 500. And we have seen since then, since we've been recording this, about almost 140% increase in breaks of healthcare data being released and privacy being breached. 140% every year is a lot. That's total about 30 million records that we know about at this point.
That we know about, and that's a key.
That's the key, right? Because there is also, keep in mind, also a lot of records that are less than 500, and those ones aren't being recorded in those statistics. The other interesting thing about healthcare is it has become a target for those who wish to use data that's available against us. And healthcare in the US last year accounted for 50% of the data breaches. So putting Sony and Target aside that we talked about, 50% of all the breaches that are occurring are focused on healthcare. And there's a very good reason for that. We know in the financial industry, we understand folks want to collect credit card details and fraudulently use those. On the black market, a credit card number is worth about $3 to $4. On the black market, a healthcare record is worth about $50. So it's a significant return for malicious entities to target healthcare data. These are all the reasons why we have to be really concerned about data flowing over open networks like the internet, and to make sure that they are protected. Again, the good news is we have the technology and controls in place to be able to protect that if we as consumers demand it be implemented.
Well, let's go on. Those are interesting numbers. Let's kind of go into that threat a little bit and what we can do about that.
So there's probably a number of things that we need to be concerned about when healthcare data is flowing across the network. We want to make sure that it's confidential, for starters, that only those folks who should have access to it do have access to it. So confidentiality is a really important service that we need to be aware of. Related to that is also access control. In terms of access control, we want to make sure that only the folks that we authorise to have access to our healthcare data do, and most importantly, that we ourselves have access to our healthcare data. Keep in mind, Michael, that the healthcare, as it moves towards an electronic age, and the government has programs in place to incentivise providers and healthcare systems of putting data electronic so that it's easier to access, because to date, most of these records are stored paper-wise. And when they're stored in paper, that makes it very difficult for you and I to be able to access our own data. We have to go make a request, somebody has to get a bunch of paper to get it to us.
And to pull greater value out of the data that's out there.
Exactly. So once we put it in electronic format, we can do a lot more things. We can interrogate the data and understand to better manage our own health. It also gives us as consumers better access to our own data to be able to use it. So that access control is really important. And as part of that access control, identity is a key aspect. Identity, our own identity, that this is the data that's associated with us, and the identity of any provider, healthcare provider, who has authorization to use it. And then finally, the last thing that we need to be concerned about is the integrity of the data. Who's actually authorized to change it? And if it's flowing across the network, we want to make sure that it doesn't change. For instance, I mean, you're probably familiar with the game of Chinese whispers. Someone at the end of the line says something, he gets to the other end of the line, it's a completely different story. Keep in mind that that's kind of how the internet works. When data passes from server to server, it goes from one destination to the other. Really, unless there are controls in place, anybody could really change that along the way. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen. We want to make sure that how it starts out, how it ends up is exactly the same. So these are the types of things that we need to be concerned about with our healthcare data.
Okay, so theme of kind of this conference is around the Internet of Things. So what are you seeing as far as devices on the market? Well, what do you see coming?
So there has been an explosion of devices, especially in healthcare. This is to help us manage our healthcare data. And I would probably categorize the devices into perhaps two different groups. There is one group which is really about collecting data, which is about health and lifestyle, and helping us to understand where we are in managing our health. And those would include things like, say a Fitbit or something that counts your steps or those type of things.
Monitors my sleep, and which
monitors your sleep.
Absolutely, yes.
So that's one set. And even though that information is important to us, it's not necessarily going to cause any life-threatening issue to you if somebody else finds out about that data. The other group that we do need to be concerned about most carefully is information where we do manage, either we are capturing vital statistics that a provider will then use to prescribe some remediation program for us in our healthcare, or it's actually devices that assist in the actual delivery of healthcare. A classic example of this would be a pacemaker that manages how your heart, the rhythm that it utilizes so that we stay healthy. And so there are ways to communicate with those devices, and we want to make sure that the communications that happen with those devices are only, again, if we think about those three aspects, the confidentiality, it's only talking to us, and the provider that we've contracted with to manage our healthcare is the one who is able to talk to that device and get statistics from that device, and that the messages that go backwards and forth don't change in any way, and that we know exactly who's involved in the transaction.
So how are we going to secure this data?
Well, in other industries, and we can use the internet as a classic example, financial data, for instance, most folks are fairly well aware of website security. I look for the green bar, or I look for the lock on my icon that says I'm in a secure session. The technology that's behind that is public key infrastructure, and public key infrastructure allows us to service those three services that I talked about: confidentiality, integrity, access control, and identity, etc. So we can utilize that same technology, which has been around for 30 years and well tested. We can, if we implement that along with the devices and the communications that need to happen between the provider or any element that we give authorization for that data to be accumulated by, then we are able to secure this. But we have to make sure that that's in place.
Right. So let's talk real quickly then about, how do we practically define the term of policies and procedures going forward?
Right, so technology by itself is never the answer. It's not the silver bullet. There is no magic pill that will solve anything, and technology by itself
Not yet.
cannot. Not yet.
Yeah.
Technology by itself cannot. And so there always has to be policy and procedures around how that technology is implemented, how it is used, and how it is monitored. The good news is that around about 2010, the federal government, in collaboration with healthcare industry, was working on a protocol called the Direct Protocol, which is essentially let's say it's secure email for healthcare records. But there are policies and procedures around the technology that's actually used that allows us to secure any type of healthcare message that goes backwards and forth. And that, by implementing those policies and procedures in a standardized way, so we actually have to have standards and they have to be followed, and we have to make sure that they're being followed. And if we have those aspects in place, which we do with the Direct Protocol, then we're actually able to secure the data, and we can be confident that the data is being secured.
So it looks like we are making great advances as far as security and securing this information. We talked about some standards around that in the Direct project. Would you say that getting it right ultimately is not that it's just critical, that it's really a matter of life and death?
Well, I don't think that we need to be ready to go follow the lemmings, sorry, off the cliff.
Right.
We don't need to be overly concerned that we don't have any solutions, because the solutions are there. What we have to be concerned about and what we have to demand as consumers is that the controls, and the good controls that we already have that mitigate risks, are actually utilised and put in place. So I don't think that's time to panic, but it is time to demand that the controls be there and ensure that they actually occur. And if we do that, and ensure that security and privacy is actually part of the solution with these healthcare devices from day one, from our foundation of the actual solution, then we can be confident that we can use these. We don't want to get into a scenario where we did with the internet, where a lot of times security is bolted on as an afterthought. And that's the wrong way to approach, especially with something as valuable as our healthcare.
Correct.
So
it's really about leading security, letting security lead as we go into that versus the following trend, which we've seen in the past.
It is. Let security lead. We have the resources, we have the technology. We just need to make sure that it gets implemented. And, you know, the Direct project that I talked about is a pretty good example of that actually happening. And so I've got every confidence that as we move forward, this plethora of devices that are out there to help us with our healthcare, keep in mind, Internet of Things. You know, today there's about 10 billion devices that are out there. By 2020, we're heading towards 50 billion devices. So that's a lot of, you know, elements that are able to talk to us and about us, and we want to make sure that that's secure. So from the very beginning, just make sure that security and privacy are built into all the protocols that are used, and we can be confident in using them.
Well, excellent. Scott, as we wrap this up, is there anything else you'd like to add to the conversation?
I think that it's an exciting time for healthcare in particular. The fact that healthcare is moving into the modern age and is leveraging technology that allows us to manage our own healthcare and to be more efficient and to cut down on errors, etc. And we should embrace that, and we should be happy for that. Should we be concerned about some of these breaches that are out there? Yes, we should be concerned, but generally speaking, the breaches that have occurred, it's not because of the technology. It's usually a bad implementation and not following the right policy and procedures. So if we make sure we get that right with healthcare, we can have every confidence in using this technology and our lives being better because of all these devices that we can utilize to help us manage our own health.
Excellent, Scott. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.